I want to talk about the other things that are in the IGCSE organic chemistry syllabus. I've actually thought probably I need to do a bit more flexibility with this as well, because obviously the stuff that's in the syllabus is a bit limited. So I want to talk first of all about the carbon cycle. Most of the carbon on this planet is actually in the crust or the mantle, deep inside the Earth, but a little bit of it is in the atmosphere. When I say a little bit of it, I mean billions and billions of tons of carbon dioxide. Now that carbon goes from the atmosphere into plants, and then the plants form sugar out of it, usually glucose. That glucose can then be joined together to form things like cellulose, lignin, and the things that make up the plant. So it's wood basically, and also plant materials in other ways. They are then used up either by the plant itself or by being eaten by animals or other organisms and become part of the animal or the other organism. Now, if those organisms breathe oxygen, they use the system called the Krebs Cycle, which I've mentioned many a time and oft, which converts that back into carbon dioxide, and it goes back into the atmosphere, where it is once again breathed in by plants, not breathed in by plants, taken in by plants, and turned back into glucose, and the cycle repeats. And the energy to provide the cycle with energy is from the sun. So the sun's radiation drives this cycle. Now, because of human activity, one of the things that we do is release more of this stuff into the atmosphere, and I'm going to talk about why. And in order to do that, I need to talk about fossil fuels. Now, there are basically three kinds of fossil fuels. There is coal, there is crude oil, and there is natural gas. Fossil fuels are fuels whose carbon used to be part of the living biosphere, used to be part of living things. And those living things died, and in various ways they became fossilized. The chemicals making them up changed, and they can now be removed from the Earth and used to provide us with energy. The sun's radiation originally provided energy for the carbon cycle that led to fossil fuels forming. Now there are three basic kinds, as I say. One of them is coal, one of them is oil, and one of them is gas. Coal often started off in coal forests, which are ancient forests which used to cover much of the land surface of the Earth hundreds of millions of years ago. And they were eventually died, and then they were covered in layers of sediment. The sediment packed them down. The wood or whatever was down there, it's not really wood actually, not in that case, it turned into peat, then the peat turned into lignite, and then the lignite turned into proper coal. And then later on human beings discovered it, dug it up, or found it on the sea and burnt it in order to provide heat and energy for industry and also for transport. Now coal is no longer very popular, so what happens nowadays is crude oil is removed. Now crude oil formed in a different way. Crude oil formed from animals and plants under the sea, sinking to the bottom of the sea, being covered in layers of sediment in the same way. And again, the heat and the pressure changed the nature of what was happening down there and formed crude oil. Now some of that crude oil had a low boiling point, and as a result it was a gas, and the gas built up at the top of the sediments. Other crude oil remained liquid or even quite solid and stayed underneath these gas deposits. And we get them out of the ground with oil rigs. Now, once we get them out, we have the crude oil, and it is a mixture of a lot of different chemicals, all of which are hydrocarbons more or less. Some of those hydrocarbons are very small molecules and have low boiling points, and are therefore gases. That's where natural gas comes from. Other hydrocarbons are heavier, they have larger molecules, and they have higher boiling points because it takes more energy to get that molecule to evaporate. So what is done with crude oil is, firstly, the gas is separated from it, then it's put into a machine, or rather a factory, that works like a large still. And what happens is, the materials with the highest boiling point, with the lowest boiling point, boil off first, and those are then cooled down and separated, and those are the lightest things. They would include things like propane and also butane, as is in this thing. The next lot are things like octane and so forth. If you remember the sequence for the nomenclature, it's in last week's video, big science video. Those are used to power cars and diesel and that sort of thing, and petrol, and those are slightly heavier and they're liquid at room temperature. And then you go up further and you find things like aviation fuel, and eventually you find things like bitumen, which is the tar that's put on roads, and things like paraffin, like this paraffin wax here, each of which has a higher melting point or boiling point than the one before. The melting point of paraffin wax is 66 degrees centigrade, whereas the boiling point of butane is below freezing. The reason it's liquid in there is because it's under pressure. Now, because we do that, we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and this has been blamed for the greenhouse effect, which is where the radiation from the sun is converted by the carbon dioxide to infrared, in other words heat, and then trapped in the atmosphere of the Earth, warming the Earth. That is actually controversial, but I'm not going to go into that here. That's what's on the GCSE syllabus, so that's what I'm going to say, because teaching is very much about lying to children. Anyway, that's one of the problems. One of the things that happens also is that the carbon will be recycled and put into the biosphere, so that there will be more carbon available for living things. And some people say that that counteracts the greenhouse effect problem because there's just more life. There is also a problem with that, which is that if more carbon is in there, there may be fewer of other minerals and other elements, which makes them generally less nutritious. But that's a side point, and I don't really want to talk about it now. Now, the uses of fossil fuels, apart from as fuels, that is coal, oil and natural gas, is also include the production of plastics, dyes and medicines. Now, an example of a plastic here is this high density polyethylene, in other words polythene. This consists of very long chains of molecules which are joined together by a chemical process, and this has a very high softening point above the boiling point of water. But if you look at it carefully, you realise that actually polythene and wax, paraffin wax, are quite similar, because paraffin wax consists of long chains, but it isn't actually a plastic. So there is a connection between those two things. Okay, so what else is there to say? That's fractional distillation. That process is also used to separate different elements in the air because they have different boiling points, namely carbon dioxide, oxygen, nitrogen, argon, neon, and so forth can be separated in a similar way, except that that process is very cold. So fractional distillation is also used for that, and it is also used to refine alcohol from wine and beer by boiling the alcohol, which has a lower boiling point than the water that's also mixed in with it, and that can then be separated out, cooled down, and then produce what's known as a spirit, which is a much more concentrated form of alcohol. So that's probably all I want to cover for today. I've gone on for nearly 10 minutes, but I think, you know, it's better than perhaps having a teacher droning on at you for hours and hours on end, to have me droning on you for hours and hours on end. So I think that probably covers most of what's in the GCSE organic chemistry syllabus. Next week I'm going to go back to the inorganic chemistry and talk about other issues, possibly something on acids and bases. Okay, so I'll see you next week.